House Bill 2191, a bill to amend and reenact a section of the Code of Virginia relating to school boards' procedures, sexually explicit instructional materials, or related academic activities. The bill passed the House February 6th and subsequently passed the Senate with an amendment which is before the body.
Gentleman from Augusta, Mr. Landis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker and ladies and gentlemen, the House Bill 2191, you all may recall, is related to having our schools that have sexually explicit materials, instructional materials, and academic activities to simply report and provide information related to those assignments to parents. And if the assignments so wish, they can request that an alternative assignment would be provided. The language that we had in the House added the section of the code related to felonies for rape. What the Senate amendment does, and I'm going to ask us to accept, is add crimes against nature, which is 18.2-361. Actually, when we were contemplating the amendment, as the gentleman from Fairfax, Delegate Albo, was suggesting, related to narrowly defining the definition using that original code section, we intended to pick up this code section as well, and unfortunately we did not. So that is, it would now be with the Senate amendment, the section dealing with rape, felony rape, and sexual assault, and then also dealing with crimes against nature. And that's simply what 18.2-361 does. So, Mr. Speaker, I ask that the House agree to the Senate amendment.
Gentleman from Arlington, Mr. Lopez.
Mr. Speaker, speaking to the Senate amendment.
Gentleman has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This is not a simple bill, and it's not many folks who've actually voted against Delegate Dickey Bell's bill regarding suspensions, because we shouldn't get involved with school board issues, have no problem with this bill. Folks will argue that this is just an innocuous bill, but it has the potential to create a number of minefields. Don't turn a blind eye to the fact that this bill creates a system where teachers are less likely to teach anything that might be considered objectionable in their lessons. Teachers are overworked. They are not going to want to do 2 entire lessons for the same class. This bill will create a dampening effect. Teachers will avoid any content that might be found objectionable. That is what we mean by a slippery slope to backdoor censorship. Do we really want to be the first state in the nation to have this kind of statewide policy? This bill is still far too broad, from art history to civics to literature. Folks get upset and say that this isn't about censorship. But then they argue that we need to put the check on the content of Nobel Prize winners like Toni Morrison's Beloved, or classic works like Nabokov or Shakespeare. Which is it? Why are we okay with protecting children from ideas in school? Government establishing laws to label literature in terms of a single factor, regardless of that factor's significance to the larger world
Mr.
of literary
Speaker, will the
merit
gentleman yield for a question?
or meaning, is wrong.
Gentleman yield for a question.
Certainly, Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman yields.
I would ask the gentleman, because he keeps saying over and over again that it's like this bad idea that we would, quote unquote, protect kids from ideas. So I have no doubt that Beloved is a wonderful work and perhaps an important one. I guess my question is it does have some ideas in it covering things like gang rape and bestiality. Would the gentleman be fine with us teaching that in, say, a first grade class?
No, Mr. Speaker, responding to the gentleman.
Gentleman has the floor.
Mr. Speaker, that slippery slope kind of idea that somehow this is regarding first graders is really sort of offensive to teachers. Teachers are going to appropriately teach Beloved in AP English classes for 11th graders and 12th graders. And the original issue regarding Beloved was because it was brought up in an AP English class for a junior in high school. The fact is, by taking something out of context, what you're doing is bad for literature, it's bad for academia, and it's really not who we should be. And so the idea somehow that this is going to be for first graders or second graders is really absurd.
Mr. Speaker, would the gentleman yield for another question?
Would the gentleman yield for another question?
Gladly, Mr. Speaker.
So again, what the gentleman just
Gentleman
suggested,
yields.
sorry, Mr. Speaker. So what the gentleman just suggested is he's actually fine with placing restrictions on what ideas we expose kids to based off of their age groups. Did I hear that correctly?
Mr. Speaker, responding to the question.
Gentleman has the floor.
Mr. Speaker, thank you. That is incredibly simplistic and really not appropriate to what we're actually talking about regarding the overall slippery slope to backdoor censorship. What he's suggesting is that somehow teachers are not going to know any better. And the fact is that that's just simply not what we're talking about. We're talking about civics. We're talking about taking these things out of context. And what we're talking about is when people on the other side of the other side of the body were actually talking about specific sections of literature, like in Beloved, which is about the horrors of slavery, and they're talking about issues of gang rape, and they're talking about really horrific things. What they're doing is they're getting into the weeds of what it was, what it meant. You're actually educating kids in as real a way as possible about what slavery was. And so when you take it out of context, and when you do that, what you're really doing is you're being offensive to literature, you're being offensive to the educational process, and you're being offensive to what our founders actually believed in. And so when you do that kind of simplistic argument, it's about the kids. And it's not about literature. You're offending every professor who ever touched your heart. You're offending every academic. They're probably aghast right now of what we're doing. And so at the end of the day, Mr. Speaker, what we're talking about here is making ourselves a laughingstock again. If we're talking about economic development, if we're talking about what we should be doing, I really think that this is a very bad step in the wrong direction.
I think the gentleman speaking to the bill at the appropriate time.
Gentleman from Fairfax, Mr. Alba.
Speaker, speaking the bill or the amendments.
Gentleman has the floor.
Since our computers are working, I invite everyone to type in 18.2-361, Crimes Against Nature. And when you read this, you'll understand why I am not going to read it on the House floor. All this amendment does is says, if anything on this disgusting list of stuff that people do is in a book, you have to tell the parent, hey, we want to let you know it's in a book. That's all it does. But I would invite everybody here to look at that statute, because when you vote on these Senate amendments, if you vote no, you're voting to say that parents don't have to be warned that this kind of disgusting stuff is being required in their school.
Gentleman from Fairfax, Mr. Hugo.
Mr. Speaker, speak to the measure.
Gentleman has the floor.
Mr. Speaker, I think the gentleman from Arlington misses the point. He talks about, and he's incorrect, he talks about first graders. But in fact, when they read Beloved on the Senate floor last year, started to read it, they had to clear the pages out. But what he's really missing the point is, he said, we talk about it's about the children. Actually, it's about the parents. It's letting this bill, what it's going to do, it gives the parents the opportunity to make the decisions about their children, to make the decisions about what's appropriate for their children to read. We're not talking about kids 19, 20, 21. We're talking about young men and women, young boys and girls. Do they need to be reading all these things? Do they need to see it? Do they need to have it shoved in their face by the education? The answer is no.
I'm on the same bill.
I hope they vote for the Senate amendments. The bill is a good bill. It empowers parents. And if you don't understand that, then you truly miss the point.
The gentleman from Prince William, Mr. Marshall. Got here back just in time, didn't I?
Speaking to the amendment?
Gentleman has the floor.
I must have missed something,
I'd
Mr.
like to come
Speaker.
back for a minute. We'd like to come back, and then that's okay. Gentleman, Prince William.
Okay. Mr. Speaker, I would suggest that the gentleman from Arlington take the advice of the gentleman from Fairfax and read the section of the code. For everybody to hear, if he's really serious about it, then just read it. There should be no shame, inhibition, or reluctance to do that. If he doesn't want to read it, I suggest maybe he's touching upon areas of unease that would be natural for anybody to experience. Moreover, the parents are the ones who give the authority to the teachers to teach in the first place. They can pull back that authority if they want to. The schools have no authority other than that which is given to them by the parents, who are the principals, and the schools are the agents. If they don't want this kind of material for their children, they should at least be notified that their children are being exposed to this kind of material. It's very simple, common sense. And again, I urge the gentleman from Arlington to read the section of the code that the gentleman from Fairfax identified.
The gentleman from Fairfax, Ms. Watts.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. May I speak to the bill, to the amendment? I realize I've heard a lot of repeats of what was said in previous debates, so some of what I'm going to say is also going to be a repeat. Reading the code, reading those words, I had to go to the dictionary when I first read them a number of years ago to try to understand what I was really dealing with as far as criminal law. And that is where the breakdown occurs, from the simple idea that a parent knows it, you just know it, and what we're writing into the law about the specific sections, all of the sections under the sexual under the sexual title, plus the morals and indecent liberties. It takes lawyers to look at those words and decide whether or not the parent's offense would indeed be captured in those words, and are those words captured in the piece of literature. I repeat some of my examples. It is a felony to touch someone on the buttocks if they're under 13 years old. Now, you're going to scrub every book to make sure that there's no such improper touching of a 12-year-old, of a 10-year-old. You know it exists in some of the more common pieces of literature I mentioned before, because that's the level of education I had, was A Tree Grows in Brooklyn. It was just what happened on the street. It was what the child was dealing with, and it was as real when I read it, probably when I was 10 years old, as anything that I might have had to think about what was happening on the playground. But it is a felony. And by putting these words in the code, in code now, we are telling all of our school boards, you better get a lawyer and look at every piece of literature, look at all of those hard to pronounce words in the code statutes, and make sure that it doesn't apply. Because the normal English major, which I ended up being, isn't going to be able to make that translation. And that's where I become concerned that it's going to be cut and dried. These are the books that you can deal with, and these are the ones that you can't deal with. And that becomes the beginning of an approved state list, which I do not believe that in context, at the proper age, in what is being conveyed in a work of literature or in political science, that we really want to put this kind of stranglehold on. Thank you.
The gentleman from Carolina, Mr. Rock.
Mr. Speaker, I move the pending question.
The gentleman from Carolina, Mr. Rock, moves the pending question. As many in favor of that motion will say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. That motion is agreed to. The question is, shall the Senate amendment be agreed to? The clerk will close the roll.
Ayes 71, noes 25.
Ayes 71, noes 25. The Senate amendment is agreed to.